All right. Hello there, everyone. This is Elk speaking here today on the Villain Viber podcast. And along with me today, we have.
Hey, I'm Carlos.
All right. So today, Carlos and I are going to be talking through the season 9 preseason speed from this past weekend. We may be joined by some of our other hosts along the way, but for now, the two of us are starting things off. So, with that out of the way, what was our theme this season for our preseason speed?
So our season speed was Wreck-It Ralph, mm, which is a Disney movie based on games.
Exactly. So, with Wreck-It Ralph being our theme, trying to tie in, of course, with Breath of the Wild, also a famous game, being the theme of the coming main season, we wanted to tie into a number of different ideas from the course of the movie. And we started things off at the final 18 with the Fix It challenge. So, the Fix It challenge was based on the scenes where Felix is actually in the Fix It Felix Jr. arcade game, having to put the bricks back into the walls. And so the way that this challenge worked was that we would give a category and a list of items with one item missing, and the players would have to choose, like, would have to give the name of the missing item. Um, what did you think about the way that this challenge played out, Carlos?
Uh, I think, if I remember correctly, I am just trying to scroll it up to get there, but honestly, I think all the challenges went well for the season. Um, and this one, I'm really trying to scroll all the way back. Is there a option to scroll to the first message on the channel?
Fortunately, I don't believe so. But ultimately, this challenge is going to be one of our shorter challenges of the season. This one only ends up lasting about 5 minutes or so. And at the end of it, the Ralph tribe, out of our starting tribes, named after three of the main characters of the film, Vanellope, Ralph, and Felix, the Ralph tribe is going to end up going to our first tribal council. Um, and this ended up being an interesting situation. Uh, in part because unfortunately, Skylar did not get permissions set up correctly in terms of being able to see the challenge channel. So while I don't think that Skylar would necessarily have been the target here, in the interest of fairness, a ruling was made that Skylar was not going to be eligible for elimination at this first tribal. And after that was the case, it looked like a majority started to form on Owen relatively quickly, with Owen convincing Skylar to vote for Sammy. So that was going to ultimately result in a 4-2 vote, taking Owen out of the game as our first. Um, so from there, we move to the final 17. And at the final 17, um, our second challenge of the season was going to be the planting beacons challenge. And this was probably one of the more unusual challenges we did. Um,
Yeah,
i- in that this is something that I could see theoretically being like an actual board game or something to that effect. Like I do think this is actually like a playable game, though it would need some tweaks to be brought from like Survivor Challenge version to the sort of version that you'd want to actually like play as a regular board game. Um, but ultimately, the way that this challenge worked was we had a 10 by 10 grid, and each tribe would place a beacon down, and any space that was closer to their beacon than either of the other two tribes' beacon and was within 3 spaces of their beacon in any direction would become claimed by that beacon, and the beacons were all placed blindly. Um, this actually ended up being like a really fun challenge to watch the players figure out and talk through as a tribe. Um, we had quite a few beacon collisions where two beacons were placed like exactly on the same space as each other, which contributed to the general chaos of this challenge. Um, but on the whole, I think this ended up being one of the challenges that seemed to have like a lot of excitement from the players.
Yeah. So I'm looking at I'm looking at the sheet and everything. Didn't Ralph win this challenge though?
I Yes, the Ralph tribe is going to end up winning this challenge. Yeah, so Ralph
But
did win this challenge.
Ruby was the
I
one
think
eliminated.
we have the colors thrown off here, I think, on the sheet.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so ultimately, this is where Ruby is going to end up leaving the game in the second vote. And this is also the point in time when people are starting to figure out what's going on with the idle code. So we
Yeah.
have the 6 chairs, where 1 to 6, indicating that they're looking for letter number combinations. We have the letters C, Z, S, B, E, Z hidden in 6 different places throughout the server, each of them hidden next to a number indicating its position. And these 6 numbers are in tribute to 6 of the minor characters who were present in different places, um, especially in the Villains Anonymous meeting. So that is Clyde the Pac-Man ghost, Zangief, Bowser, the zombie, the Eggman, and the Satine, the character who looked like a Devil or Diablo style character. So the 6 letters represented those 6 characters sitting in the chairs at the Villains Anonymous meeting. Is what those 6 letters represented. Yeah, they were hidden in different places. Like one of them in a challenge description. Uh, 2 of them were hidden with emojis reacting to messages, and 3 of them were hidden in channel descriptions in different places throughout the server. Um, a few different of these are going to end up being found. There were 3 total available to be found. Um, but this was one of the sort of things where people very quickly found like 2 or 3 of them, and then were struggling to figure out the rest of them.
Yeah, it was honestly really creative and like fun way to do it. And it was certainly entertaining to watch.
Um, yeah, that was like the idol hunt this season ended up being really interesting as people like shared the pieces they figured out with their allies and like tried to brainstorm it together. And ultimately, though I'm skipping ahead a little when I say this, 2 of the idols are going to be found relatively quickly. And then about 5 different people are going to attempt the idol command within like a minute of each other at the time the third one's being found. But only the first 3 people to use the command were going to end up being able to get the idol. So there's like a mad dash for the third idol, as it would turn out. Um, so from there, we get to our first tribe swap, where we're swapping into the King Candy and Sour Bill tribes, representing the dynamic duo that reigns supreme over the universe of Sugar Rush. And at this point, we're going to head into the Every Frame a Pause challenge, aka the arcade games challenge that caused the contestants to call you old. Um, Aside
On
from various commentary about the
uh,
age of both of your current podcast hosts, the fact is that we had chosen this specifically to be themed around old arcade games in honor of the spirit of the arcade in the game. But ultimately, this ended up being a somewhat challenging challenge, given that some of the games were, shall we say, a little unfamiliar to the audience that is not quite eligible to play the main seasons yet.
Yeah. Honestly, I'm like I mentioned, I don't mind being called old. It's all in the good spirit. Like for example,
Oh, same, same.
I threw back. I said you don't have a childhood, basically.
Yep.
um, and the funny thing is, we had two of these type of challenges this season, but like EFAP, has become one of my favorite challenge format came up last season, main season. It's honest, no, 2 seasons back. It's honestly really fun to do. I just have fun coming up and be like, okay, I can use this frame, I can scroll, I can zoom in this and like, and just imagine how people like will struggle, have a easy time going through these. It's really fun. And note to people saying Punch Out, Pac-Man, Kirby, Ace Attorney to Popeye's chin and pipe. Like, at least you know Popeye, guys.
Yeah, there were quite a few like interesting guesses though. At least some of them were definitely preloads, like where people were just guessing what games they thought would pop up. Um, so this challenge, while the challenge was dramatic, and Sourville Tribe would go on to win immunity, King Candy's tribal was anything but dramatic, as Cranium just basically got like 7-1 out of the game fairly straightforwardly.
Yeah,
However, that would lead us to one of the more dramatic rounds of the game. So in the next round of the game, we're going to the final 15. We have the Build the Car challenge. And from Mission Control, where we're running this is a challenge that's sort of a counting challenge where the tribe has to go from 1 to 45 with 3 different versions of phrases based around the idea of the scene where Ralph and Penelope are building the car. Um, and what makes this challenge so interesting in this particular season is the fact that both tribes made multiple mistakes and had to go back to the start of their section over and over. And so every time we're sitting there watching the tribes go, it's like, oh, King Candy made a mistake. Oh, Sourville made a mistake. And like this challenge really hung in the balance because both tribes left the door open and one of them was able to close the car door shut and get in, and the other tribe was not. Um, so we end up in a situation where the King Candy tribe ends up winning. Sourbill was at about 41 when King Candy finished out of 45. So again, very close. And here we're going to get quite the wild vote. So this vote here is going to end up going between Skylar, Cosmo, and Jay, where all 3 of them are going to end up getting votes. Cosmo gets 4 votes here and ends up being eliminated. Skylar gets 3 and Jay gets 1, but the 1 vote Jay gets here is from Cosmo. If Cosmo voted Skylar, we're going to a revote here at Final 15. And revotes are going to be a theme of the night. Spoiler alert. But
yep.
we're going to see multiple revotes over the course of the night, and we were so close to having another one. But Cosmo, unfortunately for him, just barely manages to vote wrong and be squeaked out of the game 4-3-1. Um, and what better setting the stage could we have for what we were going to have at Final 14? So this is one of our little developer note sections where Final 14 in this season was a greed challenge. And our motivation for having a greed challenge here was actually based on the swaps rather than the other way around. So one of the things we were looking at when we were planning out this season was the fact that we wanted to do a swap at 16 to go from 3 tribes to 2, because it's a nice clean number to go from 3 to 2. And we wanted to have a later merge this season. We wanted to merge at 11. That's a very long time from 16 16 to 11 for the tribes to stay consistent. We could swap to 2 6s or 3 4s at 12, but like that's not so great. We could swap to 2 7s at 14, but again, that's not as interesting as it could be. And we said, well, what if we did an in between, right? What if we didn't do 12 or 14 to balance out the rounds that are on each tribe? What if we swapped at 13? Obviously, right? Like 13 is prime. You can't make even tribes at 13. We said, well, what if someone went to exile? Said, okay, well, no one especially wants to go to exile unless they really, really want to go to exile because they're in a terrible spot and it'll get them one more round in the game. And so deciding exile randomly, while it would be in line with what happened to, say, Julia in Survivor Co. Wrong, is not the situation that like lined up with the experience we wanted to create for our players. So we said, what's a way we could deterministically choose who will be on exile for Final 13? We said, okay, we'll put a greed challenge in at Final 14, and the player who takes greed gets to choose someone other than themselves to be the exiled player at 13, which would allow us to do the 2 tribes of 6 swap with the exiled player rejoining a tribe. So we said that there would be an extra power for the person who took greed without specifying what that power was. And multiple people were wanting to take greed like the second it was announced. Sammy in particular jumped the gun twice before the greed tribal actually, like before greed was available to be taken. And a couple other players tried to take greed as well. Um, and it looked for a moment like we were about to lose one of the bigger characters of the night once Skylar did succeed in taking greed. In part, Skylar said, "Look, I got 3 votes last tribal. Like, I need to take greed here," and everyone understood their reasoning. Like, I don't think anyone was especially upset at Skylar for taking greed right after getting 3 votes. Um, and ultimately, it really looked like we were about to lose Sammy here. And like, Sammy was one of our big characters, especially at this point in the season. Um, it would have really changed the season if Sammy goes out here at Final 14.
Yeah,
But eventually, momentum is going to sway, and Regina is going to end up being voted out here by a vote of 5. So that brings us to our second swap. In our second swap, we go into the tribes of Fix It and Sugar Rush, named after the 2 most prominent arcade games in the arcade in the movie. Fix It being Felix's game and Sugar Rush being Vanellope's game. Um, and in this phase of the game, this is where Sean, as in AU Sean from season 8, is going to be sent to exile, in part because Skylar wants to work with Sean and is worried about whether Sean is in a bad spot in the game. Like Skylar says, okay, exile is a chance to guaranteed save an ally for 1 round, and they go ahead and use it. So we
which
get
ends
to
up becoming the saddest thing ever after when they come back, but we will get to that.
exactly. So we have the villains and their heroes trivia challenge because, after all, when Felix doesn't have Ralph there to wreck things up, Felix just has nothing to do, and that was kind of sad. So this brings us to a spot um, where the players are going to be presented with the villain and have to respond with the hero that opposes them, and we're going to go through like several cycles of it. This ends up being one of our longer challenges over the course of the night. Not the longest, one of the longer ones. In part because this is a somewhat hard challenge, and in part because like there's lots of questions being asked, like by the players about the rules and stuff. But ultimately, at this challenge, the Sugar Rush tribe is going to win, sending the Fix It tribe to the to tribal. And at this tribal, we're going to get a split vote. So here we had Jay, Looking, and Smoothie voting for Thighs, and we had Katrina, Omega, and Thighs voting for Jay. So we get a 3-3 vote, the first actual revote we've reached over the course of the speed. Um, and there were beginnings of chants in the crowd for rock, rocks, rocks, rocks. Everyone wanted to see a rock draw. Well, I should say everyone except Omega wanted to see a rock draw because Omega will go ahead and flip on the revote, not risking and vote out size in a 3-1 revote, bringing Sean onto the Fix It tribe.
Yeah.
Um, did you think we were about to see rocks there at Final 13?
Uh, I don't think in Final 13, but definitely when we saw rocks, I was like, yeah, we are getting to rocks here, and someone will definitely get screwed up. And the way that everything went in Final 12 with this person, I like this person definitely deserved the award for the most robbed pre-juror. I think the most robbed player of the speed season. But like we can get to it after we talk about the challenge, which
So yeah, the Final 12 challenge was the Sugar Booster challenge, where there were going to be stacks of coins available, and tribes would use between 1 and 7 cups of sugar in each round to race for the coins. This challenge was played either to 10 or to the end of the 7 rounds. And this ended up being like a surprisingly close challenge. Well, I shouldn't say surprisingly close. This ended up being a very intense challenge. This did end up being our second longest challenge of the night after only night moves. But I think that this was a reasonable place for the challenge to go a little longer, both because there were round by round decisions that needed to be made, and because like the players really got into this one. Like they argued back and forth quite a lot about, okay, like do we play our 5 here? Do we play our 7 here? And ultimately it's going to come down to like the final two the final 2 rounds of the challenge, where basically whichever tribe is able to win like the game of bluffing is going to end up winning the challenge. Which made it like a super exciting, like nail biting finish to this challenge because it very easily could have gone either way. And it all came down to a bluffing war in the last round of the challenge.
yeah,
Um,
it got to 9-8, and what was the tribe that won? Was uh Sugar Rush,
so
right? Yeah.
Sugar Rush led
So
9-8.
so Sugar Rush was winning 9-8, and then Fix It was had one beating, and then Sugar Rush put a beating. At the last second, Fix It changed their beatings. When the other beating, the first beating would have won them the bid and make it 9-9. So at the last
Exactly.
second, they lost the challenge.
Yep. By flipping their submission at the last possible second, Fix It lost this challenge, which was a truly wild turn of event. Um, but it was a situation where if Sugar Rush had bid the opposite of their 2 last tiles, then Fix It would also have had to bid the opposite of their 2 last tiles. So it was a pure bluffing game at that point, because of the situation that they'd come into over the course of the rest of their moves. They ended up in a situation where the final 2 rounds of the game came down to a bluffing war, and Fix It would win. Now, at this tribal, we're going to get 2 idols played. So this is a tribal where Katrina and Omega will both play their idols. Katrina's idol cancels a 4-vote majority against Katrina, leaving Smoothie and Jay with 1 vote each. Omega did not receive any votes, But the idle play is going to be important because it means that even in the event of a revote, Omega will be immune from a rock draw. And if you haven't caught the fact that the gun is hanging over the fireplace at this point yet, well, Chekhov is watching because Chekhov's rocks are going to be super effective against Sean, as a 2-2 tie between Smoothie and Jay forces a two-way rock draw between Looking and Sean. And Sean, one round after re-entering the game from exile, one round after Skylar used their power to protect him, is going to be flung out of the game on a purple rock.
Yep. Sean re-entered the game just to be voted get out by rocks in the most raw. Like this was so devastating, I think, to everyone.
It was one of the wildest things I've seen. Like, and for it to specifically be Sean of all people, absolutely wild. Um, but yeah, ultimately that's like just one of those things that can happen to anybody at any time. Rocks do not forgive. Um, it was ultimately Katrina who had put the vote on Smoothie and Omega who had put the vote on Jay. Um, but they would both vote Smoothie on the revote, but both Looking and Sean would vote Jay on the revote, which then led to the rock draw. If Looking and Sean, or in fact, if either of them had voted Smoothie on the revote, we would have just had a simple 3-1 or 4-0. But it was not the time for that. We had a revote situation, and it was quite wild. Smoothie also getting one vote there, and then surviving the second tie as well, with going into a rock draw while holding the last idol of the season in his pocket. That was the ending nobody quite expected. Um, but it put us into a position at the merge where there's going to ultimately end up being like three prominent players at high visibility in the early merge. And those are going to be Life, Omega, and Buck, are all starting to get a lot of attention in the first couple rounds. We get a couple of arguments over the first part of the merge as well. Ricey's going to get a bit of visibility here too. So the visibility is starting to spread around a little bit. And ultimately, it starts to become like a game where threat level management starts to become super important because there suddenly start to be a few huge threats, either from the arguments they're having or just from perception of them starting to shift. Um, and so we get our first individual immunity here, which was the Discord DDR challenge. Um, this is the sort of challenge that makes for an interesting experience, in part because so many people decided to just like goof around with this challenge, but also because it was like a kind of fun challenge for people who actually did try to do it. Which was specifically that they got an image with 20 lines worth of arrow emojis that they had to recreate. Um, Obviously, a few people who either didn't feel they needed the immunity or didn't feel like typing a lot of arrow emojis decided to just repost the image directly in Challenge Arena.
Yeah.
Good job, you get a laugh but no necklace. Um, Ultimately, this challenge is going to be won by Omega in what was a pretty close fight. Like several people were within a line or two of finishing at the time Omega finishes. And we saw the other submissions come in right behind Omega's, but Omega does pull out the win here. Ricey is going to get a couple of votes, specifically from Looking, Katrina, and Omega, but majority here is going to end up falling onto Life.
Life,
Um,
which has become like a pretty notable name in our speed seasons. Life is always there.
Yeah, life has definitely become like one of the fixtures of the speed community. Um, Unfortunately, here life got completely left out of the loop and threw a vote onto Buck that no one else voted with him here. Um, that life cast the only vote for Buck en route to going out of the game like 7-3-1. So now granted, right, like even if life joins the Ricey vote, it's 7-4. Like it's not gonna be a close vote either way. But yeah, life just got completely left out of the loop on that first vote. But I think it's in part because life's spot was getting blown up a little at that point. Like people are starting to realize that life had good connections at that point in the season and is starting to be a little bit of a target with, of course, Ricey also becoming the huge target. And this is where we get the huge fight with Buck as well going on around this time. And that fight involving Buck is going to set the stage for what happens in our next couple rounds.
Pretty much.
Um, so from there, we move into the final 10. And it's very interesting what happens at final 10. In We have the prison break challenge come up. Um, this is the challenge that involved a couple of mazes, ended up being surprisingly fast. Like I thought this challenge was going to take people a while, like three whole mazes, and ends up only taking from rules to necklace about 5 minutes, which was a little faster than I was expecting. But looking like absolutely crushed this challenge. And as everything's going down in this round, right? Omega and Buck are going to get into their big argument this round. And ultimately, one of the strange things that happens this round is that it's going to be the immune player looking who throws a vote that isn't onto either of the two main targets. So looking here is going to end up voting for Katrina, while a vote split is going down between Omega and um, which is a wild, wild way for this round to go down. Because like with all the drama going on with Omega, with Buck, Omega's gonna get voted out here 5-4-1, with Looking's vote allowing the second plurality vote of the season. Right? We have the plurality vote first when Cosmo goes out, and now again when Omega goes out. Um, it was not a good day for alums of our main seasons, uh, going out to non-majority votes in the speed. Right, we have Cosmo, we have Sean with the Rock, and now we have Omega at the final 10. That's three main season alums who went out to non-majority vote. Um, Kind of wild when you think about it that way.
Yeah, it's like you mentioned like main season. No, it's just that when you go on a speed season, everything happening so fast. Like sometimes these wild votes happen just because you don't have much time to think. Um, and it's just like you look back and you'll be like, oh, I should have voted this or they should have voted that, and like it's basically it. I've been there. I have done one speed season, and yeah, and I can say I actually have been there. Lost to a plurality vote.
Exactly. I mean, you got 5 minutes, right? If you can't get your plan made in 5 minutes, you're out of time. Like, it's very easy for someone to just not get on the same page as the plan when you're on the time windows that a speed has. Uh, yeah. From there, we move to the final 9 challenge. And interestingly, this is the Where's Waldo challenge with finding Ralph's medal, where players have to find on the grid which space the medal is hidden in. Um, And in theory, right, one of these puzzles is also going to have an extra vote image hidden in it. You would think. However, this challenge could take up to 10 rounds because the first player to solve 2 puzzles wins, and there were 9 players left in the game. The third picture that we were going to use was the picture that had an extra vote hidden in it. However, Smoothie was absolutely cracked at this challenge and solved both of the first 2 rounds almost instantly, which meant that the extra vote never even had the chance to go into play. Um, I was shocked by how good Smoothie was at this challenge. Like, yes, this is a challenge that obviously you can do well at, but Smoothie in this challenge just absolutely stunned us with how fast he was.
Yeah, first, like at first, players were like also a bit confused on how the challenge would work. So we had the first one, the first image didn't count as well. Um,
We posted image number 10 before it started to demonstrate how it worked.
yeah, and our beloved Ashley was still confused.
I think a couple of our hosts were a little confused how this thing. This was again one of our more unusual challenges. Normally, if a challenge like this happened, like it would involve, people circling things on a picture, etc. But especially with the constraints of a speed and trying to keep things moving, at least as much as we could, we thought the grid system would allow people to have like A for upload speeds to not play a factor in the winning of the challenge, or at least not as much of one as if you had to upload a whole picture, and
Yeah,
B to just like keep things moving. You're just typing a letter and a number as you guess.
especially because we did this challenge in a other speed before. I'm trying to remember which speed we did. We did Where's Waldo? Like what was it? I'm trying to remember, but that one wasn't a grid, so it took it was worse. And funny enough, I think it was worse here somehow. You would imagine it would be less confusing with a grid, be like, okay, I just need to say the grid and stuff. But like, but I honestly prefer with the grid and everything. I think that's better. Especially because yeah, some people may not have access to to edit the image. They can just I think honestly, like sometimes it's better even like on mobile because of the zoom in and everything. But yeah, there's the advantages for either. Like, but that's just my opinion. Anyway,
Oh, but ultimately it worked out like pretty interestingly, and this also, however, is going to lead to a situation where after the big fight, like just about everyone was ready to see Buck leave at this point, and it did end up being a unanimous vote, 8-1 against Buck, with Buck casting the stray vote onto Brian, and that would be the last vote against Brian for a long time, at Final 9. So that takes us to Final 8, and at Final 8, we had the symbol challenge, where players had to decode, using a set decoder, the meaning of a group of symbols to get an equation. This ended up being a very competitive back and forth challenge with multiple people uh, scoring. I believe it was 1 to 1 to 1 to 1 at one point in this challenge.
yeah.
Um, Ultimately, Ricey is going to get the final decisive point here at a time when if if half of the players in the game had won the last point, we would have been going to a 5-way tiebreaker, which is wild. But Ricey's going to be the only player to get a second point in this challenge.
And one
And
thing I want to say, before we move on to the votes and everything, I'm happy that people can math in the server. because we were like, oh, pandas will be very important because like multiplications and division first and everything, like because of how many memes on the internet of people who can't math. So I'm not joking. I'm pretty proud of everyone that participated and actually did the maths and everything.
Yeah, ultimately, I was also happy to see how well that part played out. Obviously, like, this is a speed, right? The math itself was not incredibly complex. It was more about how quickly you could decode the symbols to turn them back into numbers and work through the equations. But
Also, shout out to the people who were posting each round the symbols and their numbers over and over to everyone else.
oh, yeah, that definitely was extremely helpful. Um, and I I lean towards thinking that Ricey probably needed this immunity as well. Like by this point, the Omega Buck drama has resulted in both of them going out. Life's strong position had been exposed and he'd been voted out. And at this point, there's basically two very prominent players left in the game. And those are going to be Katrina and Ricey. And I'm not 100% sure if Ricey would have gone out here if he wasn't immune, but with one of the two being immune, the other one going out was almost a foregone conclusion. Like, if Ricey was immune, Katrina was more or less done for. If Katrina was immune, Ricey was more or less done for. Which of the two would go out? If neither was immune, honestly, like, A, this is a speed, so we don't have detailed confessionals telling us. But B, it really could have gone either way between the two of them. Like, I do think this round sort of hung in the balance at this point. Um, so with Ricey being immune, Katrina is going to receive 6 votes, with Brian tossing a vote onto Looking, and Katrina's own vote landing on Sammy. So with a 6-1-1, Katrina went out in place.
One thing that
And
also this season had is so many stray votes. Like there were
that's
not
the thing.
that many like unanimous votes. Like
Yeah.
like you said, the but like it's not just those votes that it would like tie, but also like we had 731, um we had this one with 611, like so
Yeah,
many stray votes.
it's really hard in a speed to get everyone actually on the same page. Like
Yeah.
the conversation moves so quickly, the rounds move so quickly that it's not that unreasonable for someone to just not know what's happening at a given point in time. And I think that that really speaks to like the intensity of a speed, the way that it plays out. From there, we moved to Final 7, which was the odd letter out challenge. And I will say, like, from the challenge design side of things, there were a couple challenges this season that I really enjoyed making. Um, the sugar booster was definitely one of my favorite challenges to make. The beacon challenge was also very fun to make. But out of the challenges that I made, I think one of my favorites was this odd letter out challenge. I was a little skeptical at first. It wasn't one of the ideas I was most excited about, but like trying to come up with lists of words such that exactly one letter would be used only once, like
Yeah.
actually was a surprisingly fun thing to make. And I think our players largely had fun with it too. Like it seemed like one that there was a decent amount of like enthusiasm and excitement for. And again, like some of our other challenges, this was a very close competitive challenge. A lot of different people were getting in on the action here. Um,
This was also the first time that we had to put on a slow mode because people were spamming. I think this was the time we implemented because I'm seeing people talk about slow mode.
yes, I believe we had to do a slow mode for both Symbol Math and this one.
Yeah.
But yeah, this one in particular, people like wanted to get back in more quickly because this did lend itself a little bit to rapid guessing, but in such a way that like if you were just guessing, you weren't necessarily going to get it. Um, and so that was one of the things that really seemed to make things again like interesting to watch. Skylar is going to come through and take like 2 points close together right at the end of this challenge and get the win. Um, and with everything carried over from the previous tribal, by this point, Ricey has run out of shields to hide behind. Like Ricey has pulled off like a couple of minor miracles to stay in the game and an immunity in particular. But here at Final Seven, Ricey's luck is going to run dry a little bit. And it's going to be a 5-2 vote with Ricey going out, getting the pair of votes from Ricey and Skylar on the way out the door. And ultimately, at this point, the game is wide open, right? We have Looking, we have Smoothie, we have Sammy, we have Jay, we have Brian, we have Skylar. And out of these last six, it honestly feels like just about anyone could win. The inside the game tally seems to be favoring Looking here. That doesn't mean that Looking like 100% runs away with it, but like Looking is getting a lot of credit at this point. Smoothie's getting a lot of credit at this point. Um, Skylar, especially with the history of having been like a very strong speed player before this, as well as just like coming off in ways that make people, a little bit worried about them. In that they like do seem like a very cerebral, intelligent player who could be a real strategic threat, especially in the end game. People are nervous, and understandably so, about what would happen if Skylar gets the chance to write a pitch to the jury here. We go into the actual final six challenge. We have the night moves challenge. This will end up barely being our longest challenge of the night. But at the end of the day here, Looking is going to come out with the win. And this is also going to be the round where Smoothie needs to play his idol. Idols are running out here. Smoothie doesn't have a whole lot of choices. Skylar considers Smoothie as a reasonable desperation final target, does persuade Sammy to go along with them before losing the vote 4-2, quote unquote 0, by which I mean 2, thanks to the idol being played and canceling those 2 votes. Any thoughts in particular on like Skylar's performance in this speed?
Honestly, um, I'm the worst person to ask because I'm usually more like I look at what the challenges side of the things. I'm not a person who look at the social parts of the game.
Yeah, well, especially from the mission control perspective here, it was a little bit hard to get 100% total perspective on everyone who was in the game. Um, but it did seem like Skylar had played a fairly strong game.
Yeah.
Actually, we have the opportunity to bring one of our players to the stage to speak a little bit. So, Ricey, why don't you come on down on the Pod is Villain? You're the next guest. Hello there,
Hi
Ricey. How you doing?
guys. Good. How are you guys?
Doing
We're
good.
doing
How are
well.
you?
Doing good. You guys were talking about Skylar. I don't really remember the
Yes,
context though.
we're just saying,
Oh,
like overall, what were your thoughts on Skylar in the speed?
so Skylar was pretty strategic. I felt like. Actually, no. I feel like Skylar sticking by me did do like really like did do like more for a game than backstabbing me would have. But maybe if she had backstabbed me when everybody else had voted me out, that would have gained her some more allies to push her further. Them further. Sorry. But overall, Skylar, they did really good, and yeah, I don't know, I don't have too much to say on this topic. I want to speak because I love playing with Skylar so much. Although
Also,
apparently
it's
they were,
worth
yeah,
sorry for cutting you off.
don't
I
worry
was
about it,
only
go
going to say that it's worth to know that the only time Skylar had gotten a vote before this point was way early in the season, final 17, final 15. Since then, Skylar didn't get a single vote. That
Um,
speaks about
no,
the social.
Skylar did really well. Stayed remarkably under the radar with like everybody really liking them, as far as I know. Though actually, Skylar said that they weren't talking to as many as people as they would have, but that might have just been to like inflate my ego. So I don't know. But apparently, somebody said postseason they were like Skylar was planning on bringing Racy to the end, like, and I was like, oh, I didn't know that. I was very surprised by that. But yeah, no, playing with Skylar was really fun. I don't know.
Awesome. While we've got you here, any other players from the season that you want to share some thoughts on?
Um, okay, this is like a week after, so it's not as fresh in my mind. Sammy was a wild card, and like everybody knew that. Everybody was like, "Oh, Sammy's the wild card. Sammy's always the wild card vote." So I was kind of surprised to see they didn't get more votes in the finale, but I also like fell off because I had to go to bed. Jay, I was really impressed by for how late it was. Like they just didn't sleep. Um, and instead decided to play Villain Vipers. So that was funny. I'm still a little confused because Skylar was like, "Oh yeah, Jay wanted to sacrifice themselves this vote," um, and that was the vote that I ended up going out. And I'm still a little confused as to whether that was true from Jay because Jay never actually got voted out. So that was really interesting. But if I had never heard anything about that, I really liked Jay. But I felt like if Jay had more agency, they probably could have won the season completely. Brian obviously did super good. Everybody was always talking about taking Brian out. They were like, Brian's doing so well that Brian just kept like going along and like when Brian needed to strong arming votes, Brian season that was really impressive. Smoothie was a favorite of mine also. I really liked playing with Smoothie. They were honestly Smoothie having comes to everything very strategic, very social, very physical player. That was really awesome. And Buck was pretty funny. That's all I can really remember at this point. Katrina was also remarkably a wild card, which was kind of weird because it felt like Katrina would like randomly tie himself to a player, but like also not at the same time. So Katrina's threat level I actually felt like wasn't that high until it was like their vote off, and then everybody was kind of like, "Oh, this is crazy. We need to get the cat out." But yeah, those are my thoughts. I can't remember anybody else.
Fair enough. That's a lot, and always good to hear the inside perspective, from the people who actually experienced it from somewhere other than mission control. Um,
Right.
I do think here at Final Six that like looking almost certainly would have been under the gun if not wearing the necklace. And that is going to set the stage for Final Five after Skylar's elimination, where looking is again playing this challenge, in this case the Hidato puzzles, for the ability to stay in the game. These are the puzzles where the numbers from 1 to 25 have to be placed next to each other in the grid. Looking has to win this challenge or be eliminated basically instantaneously, and Looking succeeds in doing so. So, with Looking surviving this, the vote is going to come down between Brian and Smoothie, who are voting for each other. Jay and Looking and Sammy, three of them have to decide who to side with, to vote out Smoothie or to vote out Brian. And while Sammy does end up voting Brian here, the other two, Jay and Looking, will put their votes onto Smoothie, which results in a 3-2 elimination of Smoothie, who has played one of the biggest, wildest, flashiest games and big personalities of the speed, going out here in fifth place, just barely short of the end. But again, that's part of what makes these speeds so exciting, right? We get these huge characters making deep runs into the game and then just barely not getting there. And in part because of winning the immunity in the wrong spot. If anyone other than Looking wins that immunity, it could just as easily be Looking, who's Looking from Ponderosa. So from there, we go into Final Four. There's one last challenge. And this last challenge is going to be our black tea challenge. And again, it's one of those spots. It is Looking versus the world. And when Looking goes out here, I believe there's two or maybe even all three of the others still in the challenge. And at that point, it honestly seems, again, at least from where we're sitting, like Looking is all but eliminated from the game. The challenge will go on to be won by Sammy, who will win the challenge and proceed to join the 3-1 vote against Looking. Before we move into our FTC itself, any other thoughts about Looking or about on the season and, our challenges, our tribals? Any other thoughts before we move into FTC here?
I'll break the
All,
silence. No. At least
all
not
right.
from me.
So from there, we move over to our FTC. Honestly, we get like a decent amount of argument back and forth between our final three. I do think Sammy holds up like fairly well, but Sammy came in as the underdog in this FTC, and it is ultimately not going to be enough. Brian has gotten the people out of the game who he did not beat and beat them by voting them out, meaning that he gets to a winnable FTC, which would go on to be a 5-1 vote in favor of Brian, with the tie coming down between Sammy and Jay. Ultimately, I think this was a very successful season and a very exciting season. Any other closing thoughts on the season itself before we move to awards?
I think you just said it. It was a very successful. It went smoothly. No pun intended with smoothie season. And once again, just another like fun night, fun season. Just things we love, right?
Yeah, no, it ended up being like, obviously it went a little longer than the ideal situation would have been. But on the whole, very happy with how this went, and I think most of our players ended up enjoying the majority of it. So while things took longer than we would have hoped for, we do think the experience turned out to be like relatively positive. Before we close things up, I'm just going to briefly mention our award winners. It's a little shout out. So we had our fan favorite, Skylar, our host favorite, Ricey, The best move being Katrina's idle play, which canceled 4 votes and forced what ultimately was the rock draw eliminating Sean from the game, giving Sean the robbed pre-juror award as a consolation prize. Skylar getting the robbed juror award, in part due to their opponent who they were voting for playing the third idol, that is to say. And also the fact that, like, if Looking hadn't won immunity, Skylar could have tried to throw Looking under the bus there. Our hero of the season landing on Katrina, in part for things like the idol play itself, and surviving like a couple of votes along the way, including getting the throwaway vote at the Omega Tribal. And the villain of the season being Buck, in part due to some of the large explosive arguments in the early portion of the merge. And finally, our player of the season being Smoothie, one of several players who came barely short of pulling off a potential win. On the whole, just giving one last shout out to all of those, and of course to our winner, Brian, who honestly played like a very solid game, right? Keeping his threat level as under control as he needed to not get the wrong attention at the wrong time. And ultimately, that's what it took. It took being able to get through with just enough wiggle room that Brian was able to get to the end with 2 people he was able to beat. And ultimately just demonstrated, yeah, sometimes that's how winning is done.
Yep.
All right. Well, with that, thank you for joining us tonight. If you have any further questions that you want to ask, this will be our last call for questions as we go through our final announcements. So, this coming Saturday will be the kickoff of our main season, Season 9's Second Chances season. So we look forward to seeing all of you for our marooning on Saturday, as well as for additional coverage of Season 9 over the coming weeks. We're very excited to see what our highly competitive casting pool of robbed alums is going to be able to put together in terms of giving us a season to remember. In fact, some would say a season to remember for 10,000 years, given the overall theme of heroes and legacies and such in Breath of the Wild.
Yep.
So with that said, if you want to check us out at our next episode, which will probably be our cast assessment for Season 9, looking back on the previous games of the eventual members of our cast, as well as what we see of them in the opening moments of the season. Join us right here in the Discord server or right here on the YouTube channel, whichever of those 2 places you are currently listening to us, or the opposite one if you want to switch things up. So thank you very much for joining us. This has been another episode of the Villain Viber podcast. I've been Elk, and along with me today we've had,
Carlos.
and a special shout out to Ricey for joining us briefly to give some of his thoughts about the other players on this season as well. See you next time.
Bye.